For 30 years, Johnny Carson sat at the center of American cultural life, presiding over The Tonight Show as the nation's unofficial master of ceremonies. Appearing live in living rooms from coast to coast, Carson guided viewers through late-night television with his effortless timing, understated charm, and uncanny ability to make conversation feel both intimate and universal. He was not merely a comedy legend but a gatekeeper, the figure who determined which entertainers, films, and personalities would be ushered into the American consciousness. What made Carson so influential was not simply his audience size, though his ratings routinely dominated television, but his power to shape perception. Celebrities, politicians, athletes, and activists treated an invitation to the couch as both a professional milestone and a cultural validation. The Tonight Show offered more than publicity. It provided access to a national audience under conditions that felt unscripted, human, and revealing. Yet the same authenticity that made Carson beloved also made the show a historical archive of racial attitudes, many of which appear deeply problematic in retrospect. During Carson's tenure from the 1960s through the early 1990s, American society underwent dramatic and often turbulent transformations in its understanding of race, civil rights, and cultural representation. Some entertainers embraced these changes, evolving with the times. Others resisted, clinging to attitudes rooted in earlier eras when racist humor and ideology were not only normalized but commercially viable. Carson himself was a bridge between worlds. He emerged from mid-century show business, which was steeped in racial stereotypes, but matured during a period of increasing awareness, activism, and critique. His own views, generally progressive for his time, were constrained by the limits of mainstream television, professional politeness, and his deep respect for Hollywood tradition. Carson rarely confronted guests on air, even when their beliefs were offensive, because his show was designed as a sanctuary from conflict, not a public tribunal. This created a complicated dynamic. The Tonight Show became a place where outdated racial attitudes could surface without challenge, preserved in footage that today feels uncomfortable, even shocking. Carson did not invent these attitudes, nor did he endorse them, but his show served as a mirror to celebrity culture, and that culture was often far less enlightened than fans would like to remember. In examining the era, four performers stand out not merely because they appeared on Carson's show, but because their Tonight Show appearances illuminate broader cultural contradictions: John Wayne, Bob Hope, Charlton H., and Don Rickles. Each represented a different facet of the racial tensions embedded in American entertainment, and each tested Carson's ability to balance admiration, entertainment, and evolving social responsibility. Few figures in American popular culture loomed as large as John Wayne. His films romanticized the frontier, valorized rugged individualism, and celebrated a mythology of American virtue that defined generations of moviegoers. His persona was so deeply rooted in national identity that questioning Wayne's worldview felt, for many, like questioning America itself. Carson treated Wayne with reverence. He regularly addressed him not just as a performer but as a living monument. Wayne's appearances tended to revolve around nostalgia, patriotism, and humorous self-deprecation, all reinforcing his carefully cultivated myth. But Wayne's public persona collapsed in 1971, when Playboy published a blockbuster interview in which the actor delivered a series of explicitly racist statements. The most infamous was his assertion, "I believe in white supremacy until the blacks are educated to the point of responsibility." This was not coded language or an offhand remark. It was a direct endorsement of racial hierarchy. Wayne also defended colonial violence against Native Americans, arguing that they were selfishly trying to keep land for themselves, and dismissed systemic racism in both Hollywood and American society. The interview landed in a cultural moment when the civil rights movement had already reshaped public consciousness, and younger generations increasingly rejected attitudes that had once been mainstream. Wayne, however, spoke as though history had never moved. Carson, who was acutely aware of changing public sentiment, found himself in a difficult position. Wayne continued to appear on the show, and Carson never confronted him about the interview, likely recognizing that doing so would create a political flashpoint on national television. But subtle shifts were evident. Wayne noticed fewer follow-up questions, less teasing, fewer moments of warmth. Their rapport cooled, not dramatically, but perceptibly to those who watched closely. Historians reviewing footage have observed that Carson's body language changed: arms crossed, reduced eye contact, less laughter. He remained courteous, but no longer deferential. Carson's approach to Wayne encapsulates the moral ambiguity of late 20th century entertainment. Rather than ban or publicly censure a beloved cultural icon, Carson chose quiet distance, a non-confrontational strategy that neither legitimized nor fully challenged Wayne's views. The dilemma remains relevant. How should society treat historically significant artists whose legacy includes explicit racism? Carson chose diplomacy, preserving the show's tone but leaving unresolved the ethical contradictions embodied by America's Cowboy. If Wayne embodied American frontier mythology, Bob Hope represented the institutional memory of American comedy. His career stretched from vaudeville to television, and his patriotism, most visibly expressed in decades of USO performances, earned him enormous goodwill. Hope's comedic influence is undeniable, but much of his early material relied on blackface, exaggerated accents, and racial caricatures. These jokes were not incidental, they were foundational to his act, reflective of an era when discriminatory humor was profitable and socially acceptable. As public attitudes changed, some comedians expressed regret or attempted to contextualize their earlier work. Hope did neither. He dismissed criticism as hypersensitivity and maintained that jokes should be seen in the context of their time. What complicates Hope's legacy further is that elements of his racially charged humor persisted long past its cultural expiration date. In the 1970s and 80s, a period when younger comics were moving away from racial stereotyping, Hope would occasionally deploy ethnic jokes on The Tonight Show and during televised roasts. Carson's reactions tell a story no script could capture: the tight smile, the quick pivot, the subtle refusal to laugh. He neither scolded nor encouraged Hope, but he signaled discomfort through gentle disengagement. This strategy reflected Carson's unique balancing act. He admired Hope professionally and personally, and he understood Hope's mythic status in American entertainment. But Carson also recognized that public sentiment had shifted, and certain jokes no longer played as harmless entertainment. The Hope-Carson dynamic reveals a broader tension. How does a nation honor artistic contributions without whitewashing the damage caused by racist stereotypes embedded in entertainment? Carson answered through subtle redirection rather than public confrontation, a compromise that, though understandable, left complex issues unresolved. Charlton H. occupied a distinctive position in Hollywood, an actor whose powerful performances in films like Ben-Hur, The Ten Commandments, and Planet of the Apes cast him as a symbol of heroism, destiny, and moral clarity. His booming voice and imposing physical presence made him a natural fit for roles that celebrated rebellion, liberation, and justice. But as he transitioned from actor to political activist, particularly through his leadership of the National Rifle Association, H.'s rhetoric often contradicted the noble ideals of his cinematic roles. He dismissed ongoing racism as exaggerated, portrayed civil rights activism as divisive, and described America's racial inequities as relics of the past rather than present realities. Carson recognized both the influence and volatility of H.'s political persona. Writers were instructed to steer interviews toward nostalgia, humor, and filmmaking rather than politics. The shift was pragmatic. Carson did not want The Tonight Show hijacked by ideological battles. Behind the scenes, however, staff reported hearing comments that suggested deeper and more troubling racial attitudes, ones that rarely made it onto the broadcast, but shadowed his interactions with the production team. Carson managed the situation with characteristically gentle diplomacy. He maintained cordiality, avoided provocation, and subtly limited space for racial or political commentary. The result was a series of interviews that were polite, safe, and increasingly superficial. The contradiction is inescapable. An actor celebrated for portraying liberators who appeared dismissive, even hostile, toward contemporary movements seeking liberation in real life. Carson never highlighted that contradiction directly, but his increasingly cautious treatment of H. suggests an acknowledgement of its discomfort. Don Rickles was, in many ways, an anomaly. His comedy was built on insult, fast, aggressive, and boundary-violating. He targeted everyone: racial groups, ethnicities, professions, celebrities, fellow comedians, and even audiences. What made Rickles controversial was not that he insulted everyone, but that his insults routinely included explicit racial slurs and stereotypes that would have ended most careers. His performances often weaponized language that was deeply harmful, regardless of comedic framing. Yet Rickles occupied a peculiar cultural space, loved by many of the people he insulted most viciously, including black and Jewish entertainers who publicly defended him. Perhaps most famously, his friendship with Sammy Davis Jr. complicated easy narratives about hostility or animus. Carson genuinely loved Rickles. Their on-air chemistry was electric, unpredictable, and hilarious. Rickles could derail any conversation, mock Carson mercilessly, and turn chaos into performance art. But as broadcast standards shifted, Carson realized certain language could no longer air. According to former staff, Carson once warned producers, "If he says that word again, we're cutting to commercial." Carson allowed Rickles extraordinary freedom, but he set boundaries when necessary, functioning as both enabler and regulator. The central question surrounding Rickles is not whether he personally held racist beliefs, but whether intent matters less than impact. Even if Rickles viewed insults as performance rather than ideology, they still circulated and normalized harmful stereotypes. Carson, who cared deeply about both comedy and decency, navigated this ethical puzzle in real time, sometimes successfully, sometimes awkwardly, but always under the spotlight. Johnny Carson never positioned himself as a cultural critic or moral arbiter. He saw his job as entertainment, and his greatest skill was making audiences forget their troubles for an hour each night. His style was built on politeness, diplomacy, and an almost surgical avoidance of conflict. But he occupied a historical moment when entertainment could no longer pretend neutrality. The civil rights movement, black activism, feminist critique, and the rise of multicultural representation challenged Hollywood's whiteness, sexism, and complacency. Carson responded with incremental evolution. He platformed diverse performers, avoided racist humor, and modeled a version of progressive decency without ever becoming overtly political. His discomfort with outdated attitudes revealed itself not in lectures or confrontations but in posture, tone, and subtle disengagement. Yet The Tonight Show remains a record of the racial tensions embedded in American entertainment, and of Carson's limited ability to reshape them. He could redirect conversations but not rewrite history. He could distance himself from guests but not dismantle their influence. The contradiction is instructive. Carson helped usher America toward a new cultural consciousness, even as he continued hosting icons whose worldviews clung stubbornly to the past. Johnny Carson's legacy is not defined by the racist attitudes of his guests but by the challenge of living between eras, honoring a tradition that shaped him, while recognizing its limitations and harms. His show functioned as a cultural bridge, linking old Hollywood, with its deeply ingrained prejudices, to a more self-aware and critical generation. In that divide lies the true story of Carson's Tonight Show, a nightly ritual that entertained millions while quietly documenting the complex, incomplete, and often uncomfortable evolution of American attitudes toward race.